the first general to get the maneuver center as a whole. I mean, to deal with it and put together. How has that gone?
Well, I really was quite fortunate to inherit the tremendous work from those who've gone before me. So my predecessors here at the Maneuver Center had brought together infantry and armor. And at first, there were some skeptics about it. Some people thought, the world might end when that happened, on both sides. But what happened is the leaders who went before me built a tremendous team here, a team that built trust between each other, and then saw the possibilities of infantry and armor working together in a sustained manner, and to develop this combined arms perspective. In the U.S. Army, we don't want a fair fight. And the way you make sure it's not a fair fight is you combine capabilities, infantry with armor or mobile protected firepower, conducting effective reconnaissance operations, integrating fires and engineers and joint capabilities. It is, and we're not merging. So what are the things that
the combining,
the bringing together, right? Okay. Co-locating, bringing together. So what some of the concerns had been that bringing together infantry and armor would in some way jeopardize branch culture, which is important. These cultures exist for a reason within our branches, or branch competencies. But what's happened is it's actually, I think, in many ways strengthened those cultures and competencies, but then also allowed us to develop this combined arms perspective. Combined arms is basically a game of rock, paper, scissors. If you show up to combat with a rock, the enemy may have paper, but you have scissors ready to go. And you combine these capabilities in a way that allows you to seize and retain the initiative over the enemy. The enemy's reacting to you. The enemy's not thinking about what they can accomplish. They're thinking about saving themselves, because you're an effective combined arms team. It has made for a better Fort Benning. And so what we've done is we've built on the legacy of excellence that we've inherited from Fort Benning's long history. So these officers and non-commissioned officers established, really, I think, Fort Benning as the heart of our Army, because it's here where they thought about future war, learned the lessons from the previous war and applied them to the future, and they built the next American Army under a period of tremendous constraints, obviously, during the Depression. But you had officers like George Marshall and Dwight Eisenhower and George Patton, all who came here to really develop combined arms capabilities. So a lot of people saw infantry and armor coming together here as a big change, but of course it wasn't unprecedented for Fort Benning to be a center of that kind of intellectual activity and building combined arms capabilities. Our soldiers and families are citizens of the Chattahoochee River Valley. We're completely integrated into the economy, into communities, really all across the area. And I think that the people here in Columbus understand the importance of our Army to their security and the security of our nation. And one of the things that we have really benefited tremendously from is the outpouring of support for our soldiers who have now been at war for 13 years. And what I think is really important for our Army today, probably now more than ever, when less than 0.5% of Americans serve, it's important for us to stay connected with the people in whose name we fight. We can't become separated from our society in a democracy. We had 9 tanks and 12 Bradley fighting vehicles and two mortar carriers.
And what did the
and 136 great cavalry troopers.
And what did the enemy have?
The enemy was a brigade-size enemy in a defensive position. So,
what did you learn from that part of your military experience?
Well, I learned a lot from it. It really confirmed a lot of what we had thought about the essential elements of combat readiness, being ready for a fight. And so we had been given this gift. We had been given this gift from a generation of officers who led, through the 1950s into the 1960s through the Vietnam War, really the destructive effect that the Vietnam War had on the Army, transitioned our Army into a volunteer force, and then affected a renaissance in our Army. As we went to combat in 1991, we went to combat with the best peacetime Army, I think, in the history of the world, probably. Well, what it did is I think it helped me understand some of those essential elements of combat readiness. But you know, when you're thinking about war and combat, the first thing you need is a big dose of humility. You know, I think, you know, one of the reasons why we had this lopsided outcome in the Battle of 7-3 Easting and Desert Storm had a lot to do with our competence, but it also had a lot to do with the enemy. You know, there are two ways to fight the U.S. Army: asymmetrically, which means you try to avoid our strengths, or stupid. And the Iraqis in 1991, they chose stupid. I mean, they tried to meet us on our own terms, and so we could bring to bear all of our tremendous advantages. Now, what we have seen in the very difficult fights and long fights in Afghanistan and Iraq is that we are continuously interacting with an adaptive, determined, and in these cases, brutal enemy, right, who's going to try to do everything they can to evade our strengths and attack what they perceive as our weaknesses. So that means we have to adapt faster. We have to innovate faster. We have to really understand these complex situations and understand how we operate to get to that sustainable outcome consistent with our interests and consistent with the risks our soldiers take, you know, and worthy of the sacrifices that our soldiers make. One of the key things is, you know, we don't talk about our enemies enough, you know, and I would just ask a question: how many Americans could name the three main Taliban groups who were fighting in Afghanistan? Now, these people, they're the enemy of all civilized people. I mean, if you look at really what the Pakistanis are encountering in North Waziristan, where these brutal, murderous criminals have had control since about 2004, they're finding people who have been just brutalized, repressed, abused in the worst ways you can imagine. And this is their vision. I mean, this is their vision that people who have a similar ideology are trying to impose in Iraq now. So I think it's important for Americans to pay attention to who is the Quetta-Shor Taliban, who is the Haqqani network, you know, who is Hezbi Islamic Gulbuddin, what are their ties to Al-Qaeda, and what do they stand for? Because if you listen to them, just as if we were to listen to the Nazi Party in Germany in the late 1930s, they tell us what they're going to do if they're able to gain power, and they show it to us through their brutality. So I think talking more about the enemy and what is at stake would help Americans understand better why we need our soldiers engaged in these conflicts to protect really our own vital interests and really the interests of all civilized people. Well, I've always been drawn to the study of history, and I think for military professionals it's really important to understand the past, because there are a lot of things in war that change. You know, new technologies, different types of combat and operations, as we're seeing now. You know, a dramatic difference obviously between the Gulf War and these protracted counterinsurgency and security campaigns that we're conducting in Afghanistan and Iraq. But I think it's important in particular to understand your most recent experiences as an Army, because a lot of times people say, you know, oh, gosh, you know, the military, they're always ready to fight the last war, but actually the opposite is the case. The problems you have in the next war are oftentimes because you studied your last war only superficially. You didn't study it enough really to learn the lessons. And remember, after Vietnam, oh, we're just not going to do counterinsurgency anymore. We're not going to deal with these complex environments in which we're contending with enemies that operate on multiple battlegrounds: a physical battleground, a battleground of political subversion, a battleground of perception, a battleground of really criminality and transnational organized crime. I mean, but heck, we did. I mean, we did have to fight wars that posed those problem sets. So I wanted to learn from the Vietnam conflict. I had a great deal of respect for Vietnam veterans, especially after the Gulf War. I never felt anything like that. I didn't think that the book or the research in any way was going to jeopardize my career. You know, some people have a misunderstanding about the Army. I mean, some people think that, hey, you're in the military and everything is super hierarchical, and you're in an environment that is intolerant of criticism, and people don't want frank assessments. I think the opposite is the case. In the Army, because the stakes are so high, right? I mean, you can't just be a yes man and say, you know, great idea, boss, if you don't believe it, right? Because lives are at stake. And the commanders that I've worked for, they want frank assessments. They want criticism and feedback. So if you offer it in a way that's grounded in good analysis, and it's respectful, and if you're giving recommendations that are clearly aimed at advancing your mission, I think the Army and the military broadly is very tolerant, even more tolerant than maybe other organizations. Well, I mean, I think it may represent a misunderstanding of where influence comes from in the Army. Because in the Army, influence doesn't come from any individual. You know, influence comes from teams, right? And you work on everything as a team. So, you know, it's obviously it's an honor to be, selected on a list like that. But also, I think, as you know from how eclectic that kind of list is, you know, I don't really personally put any credence, you know, in my selection. I think I would hope that the selection is more along the lines of selecting a soldier to represent the Army as a team. I think that if you think about influence, right, what you basically can do to influence your organization is to give people the freedom to take initiative, because they will always exceed your expectations. The strength of our Army is, one of the key strengths of our Army is what we call the philosophy of mission command, which is basically decentralized operations based on mission orders, which means, hey, I'm going to ask you to accomplish a mission, but I'm not going to tell you how to do it. You can figure it out. That's the strength of the American Army, you know, is that kind of initiative and ability to apply your imagination to problems. And what I've found here at Fort Benning and across my career is, if you give people the freedom to take initiative and help give them the resources they need to accomplish the mission, they're going to always exceed your expectations. Well, I think the future of the United States Army is to be able to fight, win, and accomplish the mission as part of joint teams, which means along with our Air Force and Navy and Marine Corps, but also interdepartmental teams. We're going to be working, again with and multinational teams. We're going to work. The problems we're facing today, security problems, are problems that involve multiple nations, and really the enemies we're seeing in the greater Middle East and Afghanistan. They are the enemies of all civilized people. So how do we work together as part of a broader team to defeat our enemies and accomplish the mission and get to those kind of sustainable outcomes that protect our security and our vital interests?
You can see the horizon of your career from where you are, I would imagine. What does a post-Army career for you look like?
Well, I'll tell you, as of right now, I can't imagine doing anything else from what I'm doing, and I am kind of in the bonus round now in the Army. I mean, I have had the privilege of serving for 30 years, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to be able to continue serving in the next position. I'm sad to leave Fort Benning, though, but I'm grateful for the opportunity to continue serving. So.